All rise. We will. Please be seated.
Your Honours, as concerns Hadžič and Badger and Stanisić's relationship with them in the critical periods, we do not have time to add to our rebuttal of the prosecution's manifestly flawed assertions, but refer Your Honours to paragraph 461, 463, 498 and 499 of our brief. Needless to say, putting their von Linie thesis aside, the height of the prosecution case, as they addressed yesterday at transcript 59, was that Bogunović, SPWS Minister of Interior, said that Stanišić was the link between Belgrade and Badger and Arkan in SPWS. However, as slide 14, not to be shown to the public, shows, this was merely based on apparent conversations with Hadžič. Hearsay assertions, yes. Evidence, real evidence of acts, conduct, and or mental state, hardly. As for Bogdanović, the prosecution makes similarly unsupported claims concerning Stanisić's relationship with Bogdanović, that he, quote, worked closely with Stanišić to arm Serbs in Krajina and SPWS, close quote. As slide 15, not to be shown to the public, demonstrates, such assertion is based on the evidence of three patently unreliable witnesses. RFJ 066, whose perjury we have touched upon, RFJ 113, whose evidence we discussed at paragraph 553 to 556 of our brief, and Babić, who stated that Stanišić was present in a meeting with Milosevic and Bogdanović in connection with the purchase of weapons. Of course, such presence does not prove that Stanišić participated in the organisation and supply of weapons. In fact, as Babić also agreed, and as the evidence in this case clearly shows, it was Curtis who was the one organising weapon supplies, including from the TO warehouses in Serbia. Doing what the prosecution refused to do and applying the burden and standard of proof, the presence of a DB operative such as Stanišić in a meeting with his senior is not evidence of his participation. It's evidence of his intelligence function, nothing more. As for Curtis, in paragraph 70 of the prosecution's final trial brief, they make similarly unsupported claims concerning Stanisić's relationship with him. The prosecution claims Curtis, quote, had close ties to Stanišić, and that he, quote, collaborated closely with Stanišić in arming and financing JC members in Croatia. To make this claim, the prosecution chooses to rely on evidence either irrelevant or wholly inapplicable to the issue at hand. Aside from RFJ 066 and Babić, the prosecution rely upon RFJ 140 and RFJ 084. That reliance is misconceived. While both emphasized Curtis' strong ties with Milosevic as his special envoy in SPWS, both failed to provide any information, knowledge about Curtis' relationship with Stanišić, let alone them sharing close ties, let alone them sharing close ties in furtherance of a common criminal purpose. The remaining evidence, including the Cooler Award ceremony, P00256, and Stanišić calling Curtis, quote, our friend and comrade, close quotes, is evidence of the acts, conduct, and or mental state of Stanišić, but really only just. And so, there it is. The prosecution case fails even to show real association with some of the critical, well, with the critical JCE members in Croatia. So even on that reduced basis, their case rests on assertions and little more. That's why the prosecution don't apply the procurement test. That's why they don't talk about the common criminal purpose. They know that even on association, their case is lacking. And so we turn to Arkan. The prosecution's claims with regard to Stanisić's relationship to Arkan really does lapse into make-believe. We don't have time to address each and every assertion, but the notion that the evidence establishes that Stanišić exercised overall control over Arkan and his unit, facilitated weapons supply to and by Arkan, is absurd. Suffice to say that each and every piece of evidence from P00486 at page 1, the inconsistent and unreliable assertions of RFJ 140 as chronicled in our Annex 19 of our brief, the witness statements of Bogunović and RFJ 153, RFJ 111, have either been misread or selectively read. A prime example of this, and there are many, we just don't have the time to go into them. A prime example of this may be seen in paragraph 622 of their final trial brief. In order to implicate Stanišić in Arkan's crimes in Banja Luka in 1995, they quote a Mladić diary. Of course, not once do they suggest that Mladić's diary might have to be approached with a degree of caution. However, contrary to their claims, Mladić did not simply record Stanišić as saying, quote, Arkan has embedded himself there. We sent 400 people. As far as I have been informed, this helped at Sanski Most and Novi Grad, close quote. Instead, as slide 16 shows, what actually Stanišić said was, quote, there is no command there. Political conflicts. Towns are falling. Arkan has embedded himself there. How easy it is to incriminate if evidence is left out. Instead of Stanišić in 1995 disavowing and condemning Arkan as a major problem equivalent to political conflicts and towns falling, we jump to a prosecution submission that Stanišić was claiming ownership of Arkan. Yesterday, the prosecution did the same with the evidence of the DB defence witnesses. RJS 02 and RJS 04. To make the claim that the DB was somehow institutionally mandated to arrest Arkan pursuant to Operation Thompson. Not that that really has much to do with this case, but that's what the prosecution now settle on. As slide 17, not to be shown to the public, shows, neither witness said that. RJS 02's evidence at page 44 to 45 on the 27th of June 2019 was that there was a policy not to take action against Arkan, but due to the connections that Arkan had with the public security side of the MOP. As the witness confirmed, quote, the State Security Service was not authorized to deal with Arkan's activities on the battlefields, close quote. Further, RJS 04 testified that Arkan was monitored throughout 1991 and 1995 as, quote, a person of extraordinary security interest, close quote. No action was taken against Arkan in mid-1991 because the general view was that it would be impossible, due to his political connections to the federal DB, to the MUP, to top military brass and the Minister of Interior, Bogdanovich. Common sense, we suggest that this must have been true, and their nuanced evidence, ignored by the prosecution, supports that view. Assumptions about the DB's authority, Arkan's movement through JNA and MUP border controls, and Badger's association with Arkan are not evidence against Stanišić. Arkan's patronage by Badger is easily demonstrated. Unlike, I would suggest, Stanisić's, isn't it telling that we can all easily point to evidence of of Badger's authority over Arkan, but not Stanišić? That has to be gleaned from the cutting and pasting of evidence. In 1D00747, a 1992 DB report, as slide 18, not to be shown to the public, shows, Arkan approached Badger to help him cross borders with contraband. Slide 18 also shows clearly what Stanišić thought of these arrangements. As confirmed by RJS 04 in the same slide, in a completely spontaneous piece of testimony that nobody knew was coming. In 1993, Arkan again approached Badger to release Drašković's money, which had been confiscated by the DB. Badger offers to introduce Arkan to Stanišić. And I paused there. Badger offered to introduce Arkan to Stanišić in 1993. So he hadn't met at that point. They hadn't spoken at that point. Arkan replied, quote, well, if that is up to Jovica, then nothing is going to come out of it, close quote. What does that tell us about the prosecution case? As concerns the alleged DB assets, Kojic, Kostic and others, the prosecution's cut and paste approach to the evidence follows a similar pattern. No application of the Braginin tools test, only de jure relationships, associations and misrepresentations of evidence. As slide 19 shows, and as outlined in our brief, paragraph 419, Nielsen offered a perfectly rational and legitimate purpose behind double hatting, as the prosecution call it. There is not a single intelligence agency in the world that would not use agents, operatives, operative connections, sources, etc., to gather intelligence about a war that is threatening the state. Many witnesses confirm this, but we don't need witnesses to confirm the obvious. It is for the prosecution to prove that this was not the case with Kostic, Kojic, and others. Your Honours, don't be diverted by bloated footnotes purportedly in support of their case on these issues. Most of the evidence, when stripped away of irrelevancy, relies upon RFJ 113, RFJ 066, and Babbage. As we've detailed in our brief, these are not credible witnesses. The inconsistencies tell their own eloquent story. Alarm bells should ring if you see critical allegations resting on these three witnesses. First, the prosecution's bold submission at paragraph 98 and footnote 411, that's, quote, Stanišić exercised authority over Kojic and Kostic in the same way that he exercised authority over any member of the Serbian DB, close quote, is instructive. For the prosecution, you see, de jure relationships are sufficient. But as your Honours know, the personnel files of Kostic and Kojic the relevant pages which describe periods of employment within the DB, and even Kojić's 2008 police interview, where he claims to have been under Stanišić from the end of the military operations in SPWS, cannot even begin to satisfy the JC tools test. And isn't it telling? Even if you accept Kojić's remarks given in a police interview, not cross-examined upon, Kojić appears to have been not under Stanisić's authority until after most of the crimes had been committed. Neither can the prosecution's reliance upon RJS 12's evidence from the 1st of October 2019, page 8 and 9, in the same footnote, support the prosecution's case. Despite what the prosecution want you to believe, Stanišić issuing instructions to the JATD, Kostić and Krsmanović in 1994 to investigate crime in Ilok is evidence of procurement, but is not in furtherance of the prosecution's common criminal purpose. This is the distinction the prosecution seek to avoid. The prosecution strategy is clear, is to exaggerate the importance of the so-called DB assets, falsely accuse them of crime, and then link them to Stanišić through a de jure relationship. Never is this more obvious than with Kojić. Hence, at paragraph 399, footnote 1706, the prosecution relies on Bogunović, SPWS Minister of the Interior at the time, to establish that as Minister of Defence of the SPWS, Kojić coordinated the activities of the SPWS TO staff with the JNA. However, the evidence is taken out of context. Bogunović did state this, but then 2 lines later, transcript 26025, he contextualizes that statement. Quote, Kojić could not do anything without the knowledge of the JNA. Nothing could be done without the JNA's approval. He also had no influence over day-to-day operations and had no authority to give instructions to the TO on the ground, close quote. He goes on to confirm that Kojić had no role to play that time in the distribution of weapons coming from the JNA, which the JNA did themselves. This essential context is conveniently omitted from the prosecution's final submissions. In other words, despite Bogunović's evidence being presented as evidence of Stanisić's procurement of crime in the SPWS during the JNA operations, it in fact is evidence of the converse. And it poses also a question. If Stanišić was so powerful, why was Kojić reduced to such a symbolic role? If he really was a real Minister of Defence, why is Kojić engaged in combat in September of 1991? And why, when he's seriously injured, does he report to the hospital in Belgrade as, quote, a member of the Vukovar TO? And you'll find that at 1D00312. Logic dictates if he was the Minister of Defence at that time, then he cannot have been playing a traditional role, else he wouldn't have been in battle, and he wouldn't identify as such. At paragraph 462, the prosecution allege that in 1992, Kostić and Kojić were informed of crimes, but ensured that the Eastern Slavonia and Baranja police, respectively, did not protect non-Serbs. Neither RFJ 113 nor Đukić, cited at footnote 1967, confirm the prosecution's assertion. They merely confirm that Kojić was in charge of Vukovar, which is the point I've just been making, and Kostić of Baranja. Asked about their roles, RFJ 113 admitted, quote, I wouldn't know exactly. I can tell you how I see it, what should have been their duties, close quotes. General Wilson, cited at footnote 1968, summed up the problem that both Kostic and Kojic, or anyone trying to act lawfully, would have faced after the Vance Plan was signed. He stated, quote, "The special police were the root cause of most of the problems within the UMPAs. Most of the violence and ethnic cleansing that occurred in the UMPAs were carried out by them," close quotes. They were harassing and intimidating people, murders, beatings, robbery, rape, and destruction of properties. The evidence shows that this is the case, that Croatia really was lawless at this point. The prosecution have to do more than just point to that lawlessness and a de jure title. There is no evidence that Kostic or Kojic commanded these perpetrators or actively prevented these forces from protecting non-Serbs. Indeed, none of the available evidence, whether UNPROFOR reports such as P00125, P00105, P00108, P01979, or 1D00702, or security or human rights reports such as P00124, detailing crimes by the special police and other marauding gangs, lay the blame at Kojic or Kostic's door. Indeed, as is plain from these reports, even if Kojic and Kostic had been working day and night to protect non-Serbs, the problem was a bigger problem. The problem was Martic, Hadzic, and the JNA. And so, having exaggerated Kojic and Kostic's importance and unfairly accusing them of committing crimes, the prosecution's final step is to attribute them to Stanišić, not through establishing Stanisić's instructions or orders, or otherwise a culpable link to crimes in SPWS in furtherance of the common criminal purpose, but through make-believe. I have only time for one illustration. First, the prosecution suggests at paragraph 98, footnote 412, that Stanišić, quote, actively ensured that Kostic and Kojic retain their high positions in the RSK, close quotes. They attempt to support this submission at paragraph 99, footnote 415, with the suggestion that Stanišić allegedly intervened to prevent Prijic from removing Kostic from his post as RSK Assistant Minister of the Interior. To begin with, P03818 does not confirm that Stanišić intervened, only that the report was sent to Stanišić. Further, as seen on slide 20, the other main pieces of evidence they cite to in support of this proposition is OFS's 15's testimony of the 3rd of December 2019 at page 36 to 40, which refers to P0318, which he authored. Again, no evidence that Stanišić intervened. As one can see, the prosecution premised the question to the witness on the basis that he didn't know that Kostic was purportedly Stanisić's man. So the witness didn't confirm that Kostic was Stanisić's man, or, logically, that Stanišić intervened or had reason or the authority to intervene. Moreover, the prosecution failed to acknowledge that the witness testified on the 27th of November 2019 at page 60 to 62 that, quote, both of them, Kostic and Kojic, always denied to me that they were employees of the MUP of Serbia, which would include the RDB, close quotes. The other evidence cited in footnote 415 similarly fails to show Stanisić's intervention. In other words, OFS 15, like most witnesses in the case, did not know that either man was in communication with Stanišić, let alone being purportedly procured by him in furtherance of Martic's and Hadzic's aims. As I hope we've made clear, even if the prosecution's use of the evidence is capable of raising a prima facie case that Stanišić did procure Kojic and Kostic, or the other so-called DB assets, Olović, Rajic, Drača, Pajic, Lazic, Sarac and Pokrac, procurement in furtherance of the Greater Serbia must be shown. As an illustration only, Olović. As his Serbian DB file P00270 shows, he joined the Serbian DB on the 1st of September 1992 after being dismissed from the post of RSK Assistant Minister of Interior when Martic announced the suspension of the Krajina DB. As already discussed, Olović, a so-called DB asset, was fired because Martic formed the view that he was bypassing him and reporting to Stanišić. Your Honours can view some of these reports at paragraph 469 of Nielsen's report. In other words, he may have been procured, but certainly, according to Martic, not in furtherance of his aims. The same is true of the claim at paragraphs 332 and 372 and Annex A of the prosecution's brief. They attempt to ambush the accused with belated claims about Milos Pajic, Slobodan Ivkovic, and Dragan Lazic, calling them Serbian DB assets, who, through the Krajina DB, Stanišić is alleged to have controlled the events. The prosecution have failed to give adequate notice of these allegations and they should be dismissed. But in any event, the prosecution rely on a partial reading of RFJ's 113's assertions. The witness testified that he knew these individuals to be working for the Serbian DB because he talked with them a lot and during these conversations, quote, they told him what they were doing, close quote. Assertions, assertions, assertions. However, as we discuss in Annex 20 of our final trial brief, detailing RFJ 113's inconsistencies and shown on slide 21, the OTP conveniently ignores the evidence given by the witness on cross-examination. He admitted that in fact he did not know their relationship to the DB and they could have been merely operatives, contacts or sources cultivated as part of the Serbian DB's ordinary course of work. Similarly, Momcilović, his personnel file, page 30, 39, 42, 47, 50, and his application to the Captain Dragon Fund, P03732, page 2, indicating that he did some work for the Serbian DB at the same time as doing work for the GINA SUP from 1991. Your Honours, I hope will have the point. It's not enough for the prosecution to simply make that point. It's not dispositive of the procurement test. It doesn't even begin to address the procurement test. Even if Momcilović was simultaneously working for the Krajina SUP and the Serbian DB, this does not by itself indicate that he was a tool of the common criminal purpose. Indeed, as shown on slide 22, P03051, in an interview in March of 1992, Momcilović confirmed that his Glina police detachment was a form of voluntary help authorized by the Knin-based MUP, and even in Belgrade, they would remain subordinated to the Krajina Ministry of Interior. We do not have the time to touch upon Sarac, Gavrilović and Pokrac. One point which I intended to correct, in our final trial brief we accidentally referred to Pokrac as a DB asset, as your Honours will see from the evidence, so we don't, as a DB operative. In fact, as the evidence clearly shows, he worked for the Serbian MUP, not the DB. Suffice to say, Characteristically, the prosecution have neglected to apply the tools test and continue to misuse evidence. Now, having just discussed the relationships, it's worthwhile, I think, just focusing in on specific allegations made by the prosecution in relation to Stanišić actually procuring activity rather than merely associating for intelligence purposes. At paragraph 20 of their final trial brief, the prosecution alleged that Stanišić dispatched Simatović in March of 1991 to establish the Serbian DB's flagship training camp in Golubić, SAO Krajina, close quote. They try to buttress that claim at paragraph 44 of their brief with the claim that, quote, as Stanisić's subordinate, Simatović followed Stanisić's orders and was not permitted to act without Stanisić's approval, close quote. Again, wild allegations of de jure authority. Maybe they are the very beginning of a submission, but they're not really a submission. It's nonsensical to suggest that Stanišić knew everything, controlled everything. No DB person ever did anything without his permission. It's ridiculous. Prosecution expect de jure status to do such heavy lifting, neglecting to establish working relationships, and this is no more apparent than in April to August of 1991 in Croatia in relation to Simatović. The evidence of a de facto relationship comes from Babić and RFJ 066, those two witnesses again. Babić at P01246 T13118 asserted that he, quote, understood Stanišić was the senior of the two, close quote. RFJ 066 at P00202, paragraph 57, and his testimony of the 23rd of August 2017, page 9 and 12 to 13, testified that he heard from other people, Olović, Martic and Pokrac, that Simatović was the right-hand man to Stanišić. As a very telling indication of RFJ 066 knowledge, and as a very telling indication of the prosecution case, he stated at 1D00021, at transcript 7344, quote, Martic never really elaborated on this. He never discussed any details whatsoever, close quotes. Isn't that telling? Somebody like RFJ 066, the only evidence he has of that relationship is this stereotyped assertion with no details of acts or conduct and or mental state. As already discussed, Junačković and Bogdanovic's treason commission operated between April and July of 1991. We urge your honours to examine the underlying documents and the underlying premise. The prosecution consistently refused to address the real point. The real point isn't that we say Stanišić was excluded from all work functions. The real point is what it says about Stanisić's authority, his command, his relationship to Simatović, his relationship to Dragan, his relationship to Martic. As we discuss at paragraph 548, the de jure chain of command that placed both Junačković and Bogdanović as Stanisić's superior was de facto functioning. Slide 23 shows Stanišić seeking approval from Junačković and Bogdanović concerning assistance to the Krajina SUP in Knin to establish radio communications. As also shown in 1D00059, an intercepted conversation between Stanišić and Karadzic on the 6th of January 1992, so almost a year later. This was also true of Bogdanovic's successor, Sokolović. He was making the decisions, not Stanišić. Moreover, as the prosecution indicated, paragraph 41 in their final trial brief, in April 1991, Simatović was a senior inspector and head of section in the Belgrade Center's second department, close quote. As slide 24 indicates, the chief of the Belgrade Center, Leković, was Simatovic's direct boss. Leković answered directly to the chief of service, Stanišić. In other words, Stanišić wasn't in the chain of subordination to Simatović, not even a de jure chain of subordination. And we know that Stanišić didn't circumvent Stanišić's and Bogdanovic's authority. We know that. As Curtis confirmed in a conversation with Karadzic and Curtis on the 24th of June 1991, at 1D0042, page 3, Stanisić's hands were tied, and he, quote, wouldn't let Stanišić do anything, close quotes, regarding arming. This is made clear by another intercepted conversation dated around 3 weeks later, on the 9th of July 1991, in which we can hear Karadzic discussing the progress of arming Serbian villages and equipping the Krajina Serbs. So, Stanisić's hands were tied in relation to these activities, but apparently not in relation to the main activity, the creation, as the prosecution say, of the flagship training base in Golubic. It's not logical. Moreover, if Stanišić had procured Simatović, we do not have to guess at what Stanisić's purpose was. As slide 25 shows, Stanišić reported in April 1991 in a confidential message to his bosses that the DB men, which can only have been referring to Simatović, Radonić and Ficha, were present in Krajina in order for the DB to receive, quote, all the information from the endangered areas more effectively. Why does Stanišić report such a thing if he, in fact, is coordinating the creation of Golubic, what must have been at the instruction of Bogdanović and Stanišić? We don't know what the prosecution think about that, because they just don't see an obligation to comment on it. Not a single comment. Their strategy is clear. Ignore exculpatory evidence and exaggerate incriminatory evidence. We see this at paragraph 49 of their pre-trial brief. And paragraph 270 of their final trial brief. At paragraph 49 of their pre-trial brief, they claim that, based on RFJ 066's evidence, 200 to 250 men were trained at Golubic, 1D00021, transcript 7246 to 7247. Fast forward to their final trial brief, what do we have? Now it's 3,000 to 5,000 troops were trained at Golubic. Procurement matters, Your Honour, as does pleading what is alleged to have been procured. Your Honours, there was no training base in Korenetsa, and the prosecution know this full well, despite their claims at paragraph 278. Tunens and Nielsen confirmed it. As slide 26 shows, at best, and I say really at best, there was a DP camp, a short-term stay for men associated with Simatović, including Ficha. RFJ 06's claim to the contrary, at transcript 23 August 2017, page 37 to 38, was based on nothing more than hearsay. As well as RFJ 137, at testimony 19th of July 2017, page 41, did not agree that there was a training camp in Korenetsa. As slide 27 shows, the defence case was eloquently summed up by prosecution witness RFJ 130, the TO commander I've just referred to. When asked whether Stanišić had organised a training camp in Korenetsa, he answered, quote, "Why would the Chief of State Security run a training centre? It would be like a minister appointed to act as a chef in the kitchen," close quote. That's the kind of common sense we need in this case, Your Honours. Not wild allegations of Stanišić replacing the JNA, replacing the Kraina, TO and the MOP, setting up training bases which no one seems to have noticed. The same is true of alleged training camps in Samarica and Tikves in Croatia. The allegations are advanced for no other reason than to substantiate this grand plan of a network of integrated camps in Croatia, which plainly didn't exist. As presented in our Kula speech Annex 2 in our final trial brief, there is really no evidence that Stanišić established these camps. Even Tunans left a blank footnote at page 185, footnote 206 in his report, for evidence to be conveniently slotted in as soon as he found it. And as the prosecution submissions at paragraph 277 and 279 show, we're still waiting for him to find it. As elaborated in paragraphs 804 to 805 of the defence final trial brief, there was a network of training camps serving Croatia. Included Bubon Potok and other VJ or JNA camps. These camps trained thousands of men. These camps had nothing to do with Stanišić. The prosecution's exaggeration of activity and presumption of guilt, that all activity associated with the DB was in furtherance of their grand plan, reaches its nadir in Lezimir and Paisos. This is a very important part of the prosecution case and a very important part of our defence. According to 54 of the prosecution's pre-trial brief, from these bases, quote, the accused effectuated many of their JC contributions, arming, training and equipping myriad Serb forces and repeatedly deploying their units into ethnic cleansing operations across Croatia and Bosnia, close quotes. So this is focusing in the principal significant contribution of Stanišić to the common criminal purpose. Many of his JC contributions. Despite mischaracterizing, cutting and pasting of evidence and ignoring exculpatory evidence, the prosecution don't even start to get home with that allegation. Not only does the evidence fail to establish that these locations were operating continuously as DB training centres, but they fail to establish that any of the activity in these locations had anything to do with the military activity in Croatia. I'll come to Bosnia later. Surely, that is a minimum the prosecution has to prove, that Lezimir and Paisos were where it all happened. Let's look at Lezimir. Slide 28, not to be shown to the public. While the prosecution make the grand claim at paragraph 280 of their final trial brief, that men from Bosnia and Serbia were shuttled to Lezimir by SDB drivers, the evidence they rely upon, RFJ 137, cited at footnote 1211, refers to just 5 to 7 men. 5 to 7 men. Moreover, even to get there, the prosecution exclude other probative evidence. For example, the witness also went on to say, in his testimony of the 19th of July 2017, that while he was present between September 1991 and January 1992, that is, during the main operations in Croatia, no one left the nascent unit to go elsewhere to fight. He testified on the 19th of July 2017 at page 33 that the training there was aimed at creating a unit for anti-terrorist operations. Not war operations, anti-terrorist operations. And Your Honour will see in the evidence, one of those operations was guarding Bobby Fischer, the chess player. In a similar vein, the prosecution's claims at paragraph 282 that, quote, some trainees return to their towns and villages to train and mobilize others, relates to the same 5 to 7 men we've just discussed. Characteristically, the prosecution neglects to mention that RFJ 137 stated at P00281, page 7, that he did not know why the trainees had left, or, quote, how or by whom they were controlled after that, closed quote. Thereafter, the prosecution's final trial brief soars into distortion after distortion. The claim at paragraph 282 that, quote, Lesimir trainees deployed with the unit under the accused command in ethnic cleansing operations across the border in SAO, SPWS, including in Bilj, Babska, Ilok, Sarengrad, and Tikves, and in Bosnia and Herzegovina, can be described in no other way. As a preliminary point, none of the evidence in footnote 1220 supports the claim that the deployments alleged to have been made were under the accused command. That footnote speaks to command after the disbandment of the nascent unit. But putting that aside, as slide 29, not to be shown to the public, shows, in relation to the allegation that the nascent unit engaged in operations in Babska, Sarengrad and Ilok, the prosecution relied primarily on RFJ 137 to support the claim that the unit operated in these 3 locations. However, as the witness made crystal clear at P00281, page 9, quote, the 28 of us operated as an active unit in eastern Slavonia in September 1991. I can't recall exactly where, but it was either in Babska, Ilok, or Stalingrad. As slide 30, not to be shown to the public, shows, the only other corroborating evidence that the prosecution provides comes from the personnel files. Each of these entries confirm RFJ 137's evidence that the unit only took part in one operation. The claim by the prosecution at paragraph 438 and 758 of their final trial brief that the nascent unit was involved in burning Croat homes in a JNA operation in Babska is a truly shocking piece of misuse of evidence. In relation to the claim that the, quote, unit successfully captured the village and the nearby facility at Paisos, close quote, the evidence underlying footnote 1864 does not support this assertion. RFJ 137 in P00245 at paragraph 70 gave evidence that the operation was a complete failure. The unit was attacked by the flank and the JNA refused to do anything whatsoever. More crucially, RFJ 137 confirmed on the 18th of July 2017 at page 62 that neither Simatović nor Stanišić had ordered them into that operation. As slide 31 shows, in relation to the claim at paragraph 758 that the unit members were deployed with the JNA to Babska, where Croat homes were burned, the prosecution cites to a single piece of evidence, P00487, which describes a JNA ultimatum in Babska in September 1991, page 7, and the destruction of houses by Chetniks on the 7th of October 1991 at page 11. There's nothing to suggest the nascent unit was involved in this operation. There's nothing to suggest the nascent unit were involved in these crimes. The details of this operation are instructive but willfully ignored by the prosecution. For example, RFJ 137 gave evidence during the first trial at 2D00012, transcript 7456-7457, that there were no civilians present. I pose the rhetorical question, if the prosecution have to do this, if they have to cut and paste in this way, what does it say about a foundational part of their case? Turning to Paisos. At paragraph 285, the prosecution alleged that at Paisos, quote, the unit instructors trained recruits from Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia, including members of the SHID, Serbia, I think that's TO, yes, SID, TO, SAO, SPWS, TO, and Skalani TO, police from the Krajina, Banja Luka DB members, local Serbs from Bosanski Samac, recruits from Zvornik and others. As your honours will hopefully appreciate, indeed anyone with a passing interest in the burden of standard of proof will appreciate, these claims are hopelessly unsubstantiated. As slide 32, not to be shown to the public, shows, the men the prosecution rely upon fall into two categories. Those that were training to be members of the nascent unit, and a handful of men external to the nascent unit. The numbers, in fact, speak for themselves. Rather than a principal contribution to a common criminal purpose, the evidence is anything but. Rather than support the prosecution's grand plan of a training base and an integrated training system consisting of many bases, they drive the evidence drives a coach and horses right through it. I will not repeat what is on the slide, but your honours will readily see the prosecution's attempt to inflate the evidence. Members of the SHID TO turn out to be a single man hoping to join the nascent unit. The police from Krajina turns out to be one man with a similar ambition, and so on. As the slide shows, even if all those externals were trained at Paisos, and this is highly doubtful, then the sum total of the DB's most important paramilitary camp was around 79. 79. And it's not merely about numbers, of course. It's about the fact that the prosecution hitched their wagon to this training base, to Lezimir, and they say this is where it all happened. As we discussed at paragraph 748 and 749, there's no evidence that the JNA, the SPWTO, or Arkan used these camps. As a contrast only, RJS-08, a member of the Serbian MOP PJM who was present in Slavonia, said that they, the Serbian public security, was responsible for training about 2,000 men in eastern Slavonia. And we don't even get going. We haven't even got going with discussing how many the JNA trained in Bobon Potok. Yet here we are, Paisos, 79 men. Moreover, it's not only with the training that the prosecution seeks to distort the evidence. prosecution claims at paragraph 285 of their final trial brief that 1. Debeli, Luga and their cohort deployed to Bosanski-Samac. 2. Members of the JNA 63rd Parachute Brigade deployed into the Podrina scorched earth campaigns from Paisos. And Milan Lukic and his paramilitary group deployed into Rudo and Visegrad from this camp. The prosecution are attempting to contrive a case where none exists. There's absolutely no evidence that members of the JNA 63rd Parachute Brigade or Milan Lukic group were deployed by the accused. There's no evidence that the one man, Merkovic, from the 63rd Brigade was deployed into scorched earth campaigns, as P02570 shows. The prosecution have no right to publicly accuse a man of such crimes on the basis of this kind of evidence. In reality, from 1991 until 1995, when the DB was present in Paisos as part of defending Serbs, at risk of being ethnically cleansed from SPWS, as explained at 1631 to 1634, the only evidence of deployment from the DB's Paisos camp concerns men deployed to Bosanski-Samac in spring of 1992, and I'll come to that shortly, which of course tells us much about the prosecution's JCE camps, that these camps, quote, effectuated many of their JCE contributions. If this is the case, then Stanisić's contribution is a long way from significant and a long way from being proven in any respect. I'll be moving to Bosnia next, Your Honour, so maybe this is a convenient time.
Yes, so we return in an hour. Be about 2 minutes or so before 12:30.
All rise. We would have.